Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the 2025 NHL trade deadline for the San Jose Sharks, more specifically who they might be looking to still trade prior to that day's arrival. Already they've moved on from some of their bigger name UFAs like Mackenzie Blackwood, Cody Ceci, Mikael Granlund, but there are still some players on this roster who Mike Grier will likely be shopping, even if they're not going to be bringing back a ton of value in return. And we start off with Sharks forward Luke Kunin. He was actually the player, the UFA on this team who I thought was maybe most likely to be brought back, still be on the team past the deadline and attempted to be signed during free agency. And the reason for this is that, for instance, in comparison to a player like Mikael Granlund, Granlund is someone who can bring back a lot of value in return because he's a really great player. And as we saw a couple of weeks ago when the Sharks traded him to the Dallas Stars, they managed to get a first-round pick for his services. In the case of Luke Kunin, you're not really going to be getting nearly as much. And so unless you had some sort of guarantee and an extension in place with Mikael Granlund to know that he would be back for the following season, letting him reach free agency was a big risk because he could end up just walking away. If that happens with Luke Kunin, you really don't miss out on much, but if it happens with Granlund, you miss out on a first rounder. Not exactly smart asset management. On top of that, we also know that Mike Grier and Ryan Wersofsky are huge fans of what Luke Kunin is actually able to bring to the table as a player. They must be, considering they were willing to give him a contract after last season's performance from him, which let's just say was rather underwhelming. At the same time, however, we also know that Mike Grier is a very pragmatic general manager and that he is very willing to make a trade if you come at him with exactly what he's looking for. We saw back in December, Mike Grier pulled the trigger on a Mackenzie Blackwood deal where he himself had said he probably would have rathered hold on to Blackwood for longer and closer to the deadline, but because Colorado came offering exactly what Grier was looking for, he didn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, and he made that deal. The same goes with Mikael Granlund. Would not have been surprised if Grier wanted to hold on to him past the Four Nations break, closer to the deadline, but if Dallas is offering a first-round pick, you have to take that. And so the same thing will occur with Luke Kunin. It just simply depends on what exactly Mike Grier is looking for in return. And when you ask, the general Sharks fan about Luke Kunin, they'd probably say, well, as long as we get a 7th round pick, we'll be pretty happy about that. But his value actually amongst sort of NHL brass, NHL general managers, is likely a good bit higher than that. If Grier and Wersofsky are a big fan of what he is able to do, I imagine there are many teams around the league who feel the very same way, because Kunin is that type of winning playoff player, and you can definitely see that from how he conducts himself on the ice. The fact that he is amongst the team leaders in terms of hits per 60 minutes, the fact that he is the leading forward in terms of blocks per 60 minutes as well. This is the type of player in a 6-1 game, the dying seconds of a third period, who will lay his body on the line to simply just block a shot that really wouldn't have made much of a difference in the first place. And these are really the type of role players that can get your team over the hump in the playoffs. I'll take an example of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Back in the 18-19 season, they had a dominant regular season. It was a fantastic, historic year. It looked like they were going to be an absolute favorite for the Stanley Cup that season in the playoffs, but then they ended up getting blown out in the first round, a sweep at the hands of the Columbus Blue Jackets, a crazy upset, one of the biggest upsets that we have seen in a very long time. And people were talking about potentially blowing that team up, getting rid of the core players, completely shifting around their focus. But the Lightning stuck with their guys, Stamkos, Kucherov, Point, Hedman, all of these players sticking around. And instead, what they did a full overhaul of was their bottom 6, the kind of sandpaper players. And the reason I bring this up is because the Tampa Bay Lightning would go on to win the Stanley Cup in 2020, and the Sharks would help them do that by trading them Barclay Goodrow for a first round pick. Now, they would also give up a 3rd rounder in this deal, and so the Sharks, it is essentially just moving up about 30 spots in the draft, but the fact that Barclay Goodrow and 1st round pick were used in the same sentence is crazy in itself. Now, do I think Luke Kunin would get a 1st round pick? Almost certainly not. Luke Kunin is notably a worse player than what Goodrow was 5 years ago, but the fact is that these general managers really like this type of player, especially if they are a part of a team that has that strong core group in place, but hasn't quite managed to get as far as they would like in the postseason. And one of the major reasons why a team like the Toronto Maple Leafs have been rumored to be involved in this Luke Kunin trade talk is because they have that core set up, but they just haven't really had that it factor to actually get them over the hump at any sort of point over the last few seasons. So Kunin could be not a hot commodity at the trade deadline, but someone that multiple teams might be interested in. Another important factor that we do need to mention, and this will carry through for the rest of this video, is the fact that this year's draft in 2025 is expected to be a good bit weaker than usual. People have gone so far as to say that some of the second rounders drafted this year are the equivalent of like third rounders in previous seasons, and so teams at the top of the table who are looking to move on from draft capital might be more willing to part with higher tier draft picks if it means to get the guys that they want this season, because the draft is expected to be as weak as that. So the Sharks, they should probably be able to get about a third round pick for Luke Kunin, but who knows, maybe they can even stretch a little bit further than that. When it comes next to the next forward on this list, we have Nico Sturm. Now, Sturm is maybe not as exciting as a player here as Luke Kunin. You take a look at the hits and the blocks and the little amount of production that he is able to provide as well. He's got 11 goals on the season, and the time on ice and the penalty killing. There's a lot to like there when it comes to Luke Kunin. Maybe Nico Sturm isn't as loud on the ice, but there is still some very, very good value with Nico Sturm as a player. First of all, he is an incredibly calming presence on any team's fourth line. We have seen just how wildly inconsistent the Sharks' fourth line has been since Sturm has been out with that injury. He provides a very steady presence in that role, and I imagine he could do that on many of these playoff teams that would simply just be looking to upgrade at the fourth line center position. But it is not just the hits and the blocks and the decent defensive play that Sturm provides, but I think what really puts him over the top and what really makes him a prolific player here is the fact that he is so good at the face-off dot. In fact, if you take a look at the entire NHL as a whole and you exclude the players who've only taken like a couple face-offs here or there, you set a minimum of about 100, Nico Sturm is the best face-off player in the entire NHL. He is at almost 64%. This is almost winning 2 of every 3 face-offs. And while face-offs have kind of seen a drop in priority over these last few seasons, it is still crucially important to be able to get possession, especially on certain offensive and defensive zone draws. We have seen teams even employ a strategy was to send out a player who is really good at the face-off dot to simply just try and win a face-off, and then they will immediately head to the bench and get somebody else on. This is done usually in like the 3-on-3 situation in the overtime because possession is so important. Obviously there's no 3-on-3s in the playoffs, but this is also done, let's say, in the 6-on-5 situation when your goaltender is pulled. Have Nico Sturm win a face-off, immediately head to the bench, and then get on more of a scoring skill type of player. So the fact that Nico Sturm, when he's on the ice, you know that you have a very good chance of immediately getting possession, which already is going to help your fourth line substantially, since that goal of a fourth line, especially in the playoffs when they're only getting 5-6 minutes a night, is to simply just not get scored on. Sturm does a very good job of that, so he could be an attractive option at this deadline as well. Probably not going to get maybe as high as value as a Luke Kunin. As I said, Kunin is maybe a more exciting player to pick up, but Sturm, I'd be surprised if he goes for anything less than probably a 4th round pick, maybe even slightly more than that. He does have that Stanley Cup winning pedigree. He did win with the Avalanche even if he didn't play a huge role on that team, so about a 4th is likely what we can expect. Then we move on to Sharks defenseman Jan Rutta. You know, Rutta, back at the beginning of the season, really struggled when he was paired on that second pairing with Mario Ferraro. It obviously did not work out, but ever since he's been on the third pairing, he has been a little bit more steady. The problem with that is that, as we know, the Sharks are one of the worst defensive teams in the entire NHL, if not the worst, and so Jan Rutta being just decent in a 5th or 6th defensive role is basically the equivalent of being like a 7th or 8th defenseman on an actual playoff team, and most teams are not going to be willing to shell out many assets to pick up a 7th or 8th defenseman. Having said that, Rutta does have some other kind of intangible value outside of playing. He is a former Stanley Cup winner, a bit of a veteran presence, can provide some leadership in the room, and so having him be a backup right shot defenseman defenseman, not the end of the world. I would imagine if Ruda does end up getting moved, it would probably look somewhat similar to like the Nick Bonino trade from a couple of years ago when the Sharks got rid of that veteran center who had won a Stanley Cup, even if he really wasn't all that good enough to even play a fourth line role in the NHL. Basically, the Sharks ended up getting a 7th round pick in return in that trade. That's probably what Jan Ruda would bring back as well, maybe a 6th round pick if they're lucky. So there's not exactly a ton of value here, but you might as well take whatever you can get for Jan Ruda. Is not exactly filling a huge role for you at this point over the last 25 games, and it's almost a guarantee he won't be back next season, so you might as well get what you can. Then we move on to a couple of the Sharks' goaltenders, both of them unrestricted free agents, Vanecek and Georgiev. Both of them, there was hope from Greer at the beginning of the season in the case of Vanecek, and when the Sharks acquired Georgiev in that Colorado Blackwood trade back in December, that Greer would be able to flip one of them at the very least for some excess value near the trade deadline. But what has become immediately clear over these last couple of months in the case of Georgiev and over the beginning of the season and then recently for Vanecek is that neither of these goaltenders will be able to be traded. They're simply not good enough. If you take a look at the goaltending stats, they are some of the worst goaltenders, in fact, in the league statistically, bottom 5. And so nobody who is going to be looking to upgrade at the goaltending position is going to want to add Vanecek or Georgiev. It just would simply be moving them backwards. And unlike in the case of Jan Ruda, where you are somewhat willing to pick up like a 7th or 8th defenseman because you never know, there's no team that's actively looking to add a 3rd or 4th string goaltender. That just doesn't make much sense. But even if by some crazy miracle a team came calling and they're like, you know what, we really, really like Vitek Vanecek, we'll offer you a 7th round pick for him, I don't even think the Sharks should make that trade. The fact is that these two goaltenders, they're not very good, but at the very least, they'll play in the NHL and not be the absolute black hole in the net and let in 20 goals a game. And if you were to get rid of someone like Vanecek, you would have to fill in that spot as a backup goaltender, and the likely call-up would be Yaroslav Askarov, who at this point of the season, I imagine you would want to play primarily with the San Jose Barracuda if you have a choice, and a 7th round pick just is not really enough value to kind of torpedo the Barracuda's chances of making the playoffs and getting a decent finish in the playoffs for the regular season, just to have Askarov come up here and play a few games and maybe even lose them with the weaker defense that the Sharks have in front. So it is probably in their best interest. Hold on to Vanecek and Georgiev for the rest of the season. You're not going to get any real value in return. Next, we move on to Mario Ferraro. So he is actually not an unrestricted free agent. Important differentiation for the other players I've already talked about, which means, very most importantly, the Sharks are not on a timer just yet to actually try and trade him away. If this deadline comes and goes and they don't move on from Ferraro, they will have the opportunity either to trade him in free agency this year in the offseason or to just hold on to him for next year because he is once more under contract. But the reason I do bring him up is that we have been hearing a lot of Mario Ferraro's names in trade rumors, not even just this season, but as well as the previous season as well, and it has become maybe more of a possibility that he does end up getting traded. Now, similar to Luke Cunnin, many people will say, Ferraro must not really have any value around the NHL. We'd be lucky to get a 6th or a 7th round pick for him, but I would actually disagree with that. Obviously, Ferraro's play with the Sharks throughout many of the past few years hasn't been particularly consistent and not even really at a very high level, but it should be noted here that Mario Ferraro, he kind of feels like a veteran player, but he's actually still relatively young for a defenseman in the NHL, 26, 27 years old, and mid-20s, you might not be thinking that, but for defensemen who can take that extra bit of time to develop, we have seen many times in the past defensemen really have that switch flip at this point of their career and suddenly really get it and have them become successful defensemen. I think a really good example of that is Gustav Forsling. Last season with the Florida Panthers, a waiver wire pickup. You're not really thinking much of him, but then he slowly but surely became one of the better defensive defensemen in the entire league, signed a long-term contract with the Florida Florida Panthers, and then would end up winning the Stanley Cup that very season. And so this is a similar type of path that Mario Ferraro could very well follow. Some general managers might be looking at what Ferraro has done here with the San Jose Sharks, the fact that he has literally never managed to make the playoffs with this team, and they might feel as though that the development with the Sharks has not been handled correctly, and I wouldn't even necessarily blame them for that. We have seen Ferraro have to play way above his pay grade while with the San Jose Sharks because they're constantly using him as a top pairing defenseman just simply for a lack of a better option, even if he'd be much more suited for, let's say, a fourth defensive role, maybe even a fifth defensive role on a team. And if you put him around a system that could help him succeed, that could be a secret in unlocking Mario Ferraro's potential, because one big thing about him is that he has certain aspects that are very difficult to teach a player, which is, like with Luke Kunin, that willingness to do whatever it takes to win. He leads all Sharks defensemen in terms of hits per 60 by a significant margin. The same goes for blocks per 60. He will do whatever you need him to do, whether that's play a top role or a bottom role. You know you're going to get 100% of that effort every single night. He is a heart and soul type of player. Again, very, very valuable to have during the playoffs. So to me, if Mario Ferraro is on the market, there will absolutely be teams who will view him kind of as like a project type of player, where you don't want to take a huge swing and give up a ton of assets, because he is in the end a risk. Maybe indeed Ferraro is just as good as we see him in San Jose, which is not that great, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone is willing to take a chance. I wouldn't be willing to move on from Ferraro just for like a 5th round pick or a 4th round pick, but if you can bring back some halfway decent value, maybe a prospect, maybe someone who's somewhat closer to making it to the NHL, who fits more so into the Sharks' current age window, Ferraro could be moved on from. But again, we are not in any sort of rush position just yet. You can afford to hold on to Ferraro this trade deadline. There's no risk in doing so. Perhaps if we see Ferraro do get traded, it'll happen closer to the draft this season. And then finally, I do want to talk about a sort of others category here. You know, there are certainly other players on this Sharks roster who could end up being involved in a trade. And the reason I say this is because a couple of weeks ago, the Sharks in that Granlund deal picked up the first round pick from the Dallas Stars, and I have constantly talked about the fact that it is very possible that the Sharks don't ever actually end up making that selection in the draft with that Dallas pick, and instead are going to use it to try and make a different deal, maybe to bring in a defenseman who is either close to making an NHL impact or has already made it to the NHL. And a first round pick, especially in a weaker draft, can be a centerpiece of such a deal, but it might not be enough to really get the Sharks what they are looking for, and so they would probably have to package other players, and I don't think these rental guys like Kunin and Sturm would be enough. You probably want to give somebody with a little bit more value. So you look at maybe some of the Sharks prospects who are in play. Obviously, Celebrini, Smith, Dickinson, pretty much off the table, but depending on the type of player you are bringing in, you would be willing to give up like a Bordeleau or Gushin on the lower end, but potentially even like a Halttunen or a Musty, maybe even a Chernyshov on the higher end if you're really getting back a very, very good defensive prospect. In terms of roster players, I look at someone like Jake Walman. He has shown some inconsistencies this season, but I think Walman, maybe being more of an emotional type of player, is struggling with the amount of losing that the Sharks have been doing this season, and would probably be able to find more of a consistent level of play that we have seen that when he's on, he actually plays very well. He would be able to find that level if he were to go to a team that actually is winning and is more of a playoff squad. You could also look at someone like a Fabian Zetterlund, who has been very good for the Sharks since being acquired in that Timo Meier trade, but isn't fully involved in the picture of the Sharks' future. I don't think Greer would hate to keep him around, but indeed, if it comes to picking up a strong defensive prospect who could really help in an area that you are lacking in currently, moving on from a player like Fabian Zetterlund could bring you a lot of value in return. So there are options here. I don't know if this deal will get made at the trade deadline. Kind of like with Ferraro, you might expect it a little bit closer to the draft, but there are options on the table for Mike Greer. We are past the point of simply just trading players away for value. It is now the time to be more aggressive and kind of like a buyer at the deadline, not so much in bringing in rental players, but players who will factor into the future for the San Jose Sharks. Class dismissed.